Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today we're looking at the best decks in standard post-unbroken bonds. The set is going to be huge and very impactful to our format. So we're going to be looking at how the current archetypes in the format are changing, what they can add into their decks, what threats come out from the new set, as well as looking at brand new archetypes and how they will be affecting our metagame. So let's jump straight into it. First of all, taking a look at the top decks pre-unbroken bonds. Zapdos variant, ZoroRoc variants, Pika Rom, Ultra Malamar, and Blacephalon being like the kind of big 5 decks that we have pre-unbroken bonds. Then there's some stalling variants out there, Celosaur, Passimian, Koko, Beast Box. Those two are kind of like fighting type decks trying to counter some of the more popular, ZoroArks and Pika Roms out there. And there's also Sylveon, another milling archetype, QuagNag recently popping up, being an interesting sort of rogue variant, as well as Vikavolt Rayquaza, which is still kind of hanging on in there, even though it's kind of fallen a little bit out of favor since Pika Rom came out. It's been the sort of subpar aggressive archetype, but it's still just about clinging on, and I think there are a couple new additions from the new set, so it's worth discussing. So let's have a look at the brand new archetypes now coming in from Unbroken Bonds. Definitely good. I think there's going to be Reshiram&Charizard GX based decks. There's also going to be Baby Blacephalon, the non-GX based builds, which seem to be very strong as a quad archetype, where he is just going to be using, B-strings, batons, welders to get energy acceleration, and then using Fire Crystal to reload those energies that you keep discarding for his damage. And Gardevoir&Sylveon tag team, I also predict to be a very strong archetype. I think there's a lot going for it. It's difficult to interact with the deck because you are going to be using that Ribombe to stop people gusting up things, so you can protect your energy for the entire game. You can try and Acerola bounce, and you can try and build towards your big GX attack, which can sometimes win games on its own if the opponent doesn't have a stable engine to fall back on. So that's definitely something to bear in mind. Then we have a handful of maybes, some things that I'm a little bit less sure of. I think combo Honchkrow is most likely to be a thing. I was very close to putting this into the definitely good category, but it is very reliant on, just going for the unfair GX and hoping that's your win condition. The Vikavolt deck is also a promising Stage 2 build, which I think actually has some good potential here. Persian Box is going to be, mainly using Persian alongside some other boost energy candidates that really enjoy using that energy, as well as maybe some tech Pokemon for some awkward matchups. Porygon-Z is trying to be the accelerator for lots of different tag teams to try and tank, use Acerola, and then sort of rain dance your way onto the right GX attacker of your choosing. Buzzwole Pheromosa was very popular in Japan, but that was pre-Charizard and Reshiram and Baby Clown coming out. So obviously being weak to fire, there's that question mark around it. There's the Giovanni's Mill archetype coming out from the set with the Rhydon and the Digletts and whatnot. We have Crabominable, a nice fight-alone style attacker. He's also a fighting type. We have Greninja&Zoroark trying to build the board with a bunch of energy, kind of a throwback to Turbo Darkrai. And there's Psychic Spread builds in Weezing and Gengar. I'm sort of lumping them into one because they suffer the same issues, I think, and they have similar strengths. So the real things to bear in mind is that fire decks really are on the rise. I can foresee, similar to how Team Up brought about Pika Rom and Zapdos jumping straight into the top of our meta and being top tier contenders, I can see the two fire archetypes, the new tag team and the non-GX build, both of them now try and take the mantle and jump towards that top tier of archetypes. I really do think they come in at a very high power level. Gardevoir&Sylveon, maybe not guaranteed because there are so many aggressive decks coming out, but I think it's just strong enough to also be in contention as well. So definitely a deck to look out for. A few things also to note is that both combo Honchkrow and Gardevoir&Sylveon, part of their win condition is just to wreck your hand and leave you with unplayables and put you in top deck mode. So that's something to bear in mind when we talk about these engines. Things like ZoroRoc or always being able to trade your way out of danger, having Salazzle to give you a lot of outs to, be able to get out of low hand sizes, and also things like Oranguru might be sneaking into decks as well just to protect against those sorts of approaches. So something to bear in mind for sure. Let's start off with the strengths and weaknesses of some of these brand new archetypes. Like I said, I really do think there's something behind the Reshiram&Charizard GX deck. It's got massive one-hit KO potential, great energy acceleration via Welder to get you straight into double blazes and flare strikes as quickly as possible. You have a mammoth amount of hit points. You have a great draw engine behind you if you go for the Salazzle-based build. There's also been successful builds in Japan that is mainly using Flareon GX and then like a green search-based engine as well, something to bear in mind. In both cases, this is a really nice engine to fall back on. The weaknesses are, of course, Reshiram is a big tag team, so if it is going to get countered by some water techs or some other non-GX builds, you can just get out prize traded a lot of the time, and you are quite reliant on Welder. Obviously, Welder's a phenomenal supporter card for you, but it means you're not using Guzmas on certain turns. It means you're not able to Cynthia for a big hand reload. You're just getting a 3-draw here and there, so the fact that you have to Welder on many of these turns might be a little bit awkward for you. Obviously, being a tag team is a bit less so the case for this deck than it is for maybe like the Baby Clowns deck, because you basically can tank here and there, unlike the Baby Clown deck. But it's still something that I think is a small weakness to fall back on. The fact that you have to use Welder a good amount of turns during the game without any option. Like, there's no other choice because you just have to reload a bunch of energy no matter what. So that's a small downside for this deck. But overall, I think it's very, very strong for sure. Baby Blacephalon might be my top pick for the best deck coming out of this set, to be honest. I think it's very powerful. It's a non-GX deck that has 120 hit points around the board. And that's really powerful because it can compete with Zapdos straight out the gate just because it can out-resource Zapdos in some cases. 120 hit points is annoying for them. They have to put down Jolteons and Koko GXs if they want to deal with this clown, and that means that you can have a favorable prize trade against them because they'll only have, you know, like Sledgehammer turns, and then having to spend double Electro Power into this guy a couple times is really, really awkward. So I think you can actually have a favorable prize race against Zapdos, which is very powerful for this deck. That's pretty much what you need to do if you want to become the new best non-GX build, and this straight away ticks that box. It's got huge one-hit KO potential with its Flame Ball Circus attack. That's what the deck's going to revolve around, retaining energy, springing a bunch into play via Welder and B-Strings, keeping them around with Batons, and using Fire Crystal as well to recover them for that Flame Ball Circus damage that you need to reload every single turn. I think this is unlikely to play a Salazzle engine. If it does, it'll be a thin line rather than the thick line that I would more reasonably imagine in the Reshiram deck, because you're already discarding so many fires that playing Salazzle means that you're just discarding too many fires almost. It's like an anti-synergy because both things are trying to discard the amount of energy, and at some point you need to reload them. So it feels like you're Salazzle digging just to find more fire energies, which doesn't really make sense. So I can mainly foresee this being a greens search-based build with Welder alongside it. I think the issues is you are a little bit item reliant with those Batons, at least in the early turns pre-B-String, and you are reliant on Welder as well. And you also need to keep digging into Fire Crystals each turn. You won't have many turns free to use Guzmas and whatnot, so you're pretty much just trying to prize trade through the active whenever you can and reaching big numbers. So something to bear in mind, you might get, you know, out of resources sometimes if you're having to Flame Ball Circus into very chunky non-GXs over and over again because you are limited to the amount of Fire Crystals you play, but you're obviously going to have a high count of fire anyway, so it shouldn't be the biggest problem in the world, but definitely something to bear in mind. Being a little bit weak, or sorry, not really weak, but reliant on Batons and Rings might be the only real downside of this archetype, really. On to Gardevoir&Sylveon, the other main contender, I think, coming out from this set. It's got great disruption because your opponent just can't interact with you. You're just going to sit there using Fairy Song for the first couple turns, building up your energy on benched Gardevoir&Sylveons. Once you've got this Rabombe out, your opponent can't gust up your energy, essentially. So even if they are taking a knockout on your first tag team, you're only really losing one colorless energy. And usually you're going to be using things like Acerola. We've also got a lot of Fairy Charms out there. That's what I mean by tanking and walling. You have a good 260 hit point baseline, and you can be using, you know, the Ability Fairy Charm, the Lightning Fairy Charm, the Ultra Beast Fairy Charm. You have lots of ways to defend against opposing attackers via this Gardevoir&Sylveon just by having all these fairy options, so definitely something to bear in mind. Your damage output isn't the best. That's kind of the thing that I think is the biggest downside here. Kaleidostorm only doing 150, so even with Choice Band you're out of range of a number of non-GX, a lot of basic GXs, let alone stage 1s. You're basically out of range of all of them. It's only really Magical Miracle that can get a big one-hit KO, and that's even with Choice Band at times, which, as I just mentioned, you might be playing the Fairy Charm, so having a split there could be a little bit awkward. But the big payoff of Magical Miracle is huge. You know, leave your opponent with no hand. And if they're not playing a draw engine, especially, well, like ZoroRoc seems to be the best way to get out of this, but even like a Oranguru could be a way around it. A lot of other decks are definitely going to struggle, and if people are going towards green search-based builds especially, that's going to be disgusting for them. So leaving your opponent with no hand is a win condition in itself, and that's why I believe this archetype may still have legs, even though there are some very powerful potential one-hit KO decks out there. I think 260 might be enough hit points. We may even be seeing things like Wondrous Labyrinth and Choice Helmet and stuff like that creeping into this deck just to make it more Celosaur-esque, more tanky, just so that you can compete with these other builds, especially things like Reshiram seems to be able to push a little bit too easily right now, just with them having choice bans. So having some extra tankability on your side will really go a long way, in my opinion, but I think this deck definitely has a lot of potential, and I can foresee it being one that I want to test out before a lot of the others, just because it looks very, very strong to miracle away your opponent's hand entirely and leave them with no option, basically. Next up, Combo Honchkrow. The kind of idea around this is you're going to really focus on having a really thick Honchkrow line with a lot of Dusk Stones. Probably going to be having Let Loose Marshadow in here as well, so that you let loose your opponent to a low hand size and then use that unfair GX attack on turn 1, going second if you're able to, or if you've gone first on your second turn. And you're most likely going to combine this as well with things like Mismagius, maybe a thin line, because you're already playing 4 Duskstone in the list. And actually having more Misdreavus means that you are able to get into your Honchkrow a lot more easily, because you can actually knock out your own Mismagius from the active position. That's one thing I underestimated when initially rating Mismagius, is that similar to Shedinja, the ability that makes it, just discard itself to become a tool card, Mismagius can knock itself out even when it's in the active position, so it effectively gives you a better lead Pokemon than anything else. It's essentially a free retreater that can also draw you cards, which is actually pretty cool. But the idea here is really just go for Unfair GX alongside Let Loose. Your opponent whiffs stuff for a turn or two, and you just win off of Featherstorm tempo. That's the whole idea behind the deck. So you really are just trying to disrupt the opponent's hand from the offset. Even if they are able to, fortunately top deck out of it, you're probably playing a large amount of Let Loose, so you'll continue to go down that line. You also have your own ability, which is even more denial from your opponent, because a handful of their cards in their deck won't work anyway as long as Honchkrow's in the active, so that's already awkward to deal with. There's a handful of decks that are very special energy reliant from the offset, so it's similar to like a Glaceon, that like your opponent may have to spend a lot of Guzmas just to do anything on certain turns. Weaknesses is that you're really weak to lightning. Obviously your damage output isn't high, so like when you get hit with lightning attackers, you really don't have a fallback at all. And decks with inbuilt draw can get around Unfair GX, obviously, if your opponent's able to develop draw engine Pokemon before you get the Unfair GX going, or if they just fortunately top deck out of this. You're inherently not the most powerful deck out there. There are things that can hit harder than you, there are things that have more hit points and whatnot, so if the Unfair GX Gambit doesn't pay off, you're going to lose the game. That's the only real downside to this deck. That's what makes me hesitant. That's why I think it might be more of, like I say, this sort of Gambit-based deck rather than a highly competitive one. But if the odds are that you're going to leave your opponent dead drawing for a couple turns and you can just Featherstorm a couple times and get through some basics and win, then that's a genuine threat, and it's something to bear in mind. So definitely going to respect this card for all it's worth, because that GX attack is very, very scary to deal with. Vikavolt, as I mentioned earlier, it's a stage 2 Pokemon that immediately makes me skeptical, but there's some huge payoff here, and the Charger Bug ability allowing you to just attach 2 of these onto a Vikavolt every turn is just absolutely insane. So you can Lightning Strike and then just use things like Brock's Grit and Rescue Stretcher to recharge your Charger Bugs back into your deck and search them out. The great thing is we have so much Ball Search right now. You can play like thick Great Ball, you can play thick Pokecom. You can really just recycle these Charger Bugs very, very easily. It's like the most searchable energy possible in the game. And Vikavolt can take full advantage of it because it does 220 on its own. And with Choice Band, you can get to 250. That's some really good numbers right there. And it's definitely a threat to bear in mind. There's even Electro Powers if you want to have a couple in there just for some big tag team knockouts all in one go if you really feel that's necessary. So I think there's a big payoff here. You have inbuilt no weakness thanks to your own ability, which is really cool as well. So you're pretty tanky as a 150 hit point non-GX. It's actually pretty awkward for some other non-GXs to get through you, the likes of Zapdos, for example. So I can definitely foresee a very low energy count based Vikavolt deck that just uses Charger Bug recycling itself as your main attachments throughout every single turn. I really want to experiment with something like that. With big one-hit KO potential, I think there's the big payoff to building a very unique deck. It might even be energyless. I'm genuinely thinking that could be the way I build this Vikavolt deck, and just relying on 4 Charger Bugs and recycling them every turn and just trying to get the most out of Lightning Strike. You know, if there are going to be these tag team based builds, you may only need to Lightning Strike 2 times and you've won the game. So that's definitely something I'm looking into. Very, very cool. The issues are that you are stage 2 reliant, and recycling this Charger Bug sounds easy in theory, but it is going to require, you know, 4 rescue stretchers, maybe Rock's Grit on top of that, and you need to have a stupid amount of ball search, because you'll need to be searching your Vikavolt out in the first place and continue to search out your Vikavolt throughout the entire game, whilst also using ball search to find Charger Bugs. So that may be the only real weakness of this deck. Something I want to play around with for sure, though. At the moment, I'm thinking of a Jirachi-based build. Only really makes sense because you want to be finding things like rare candies anyway. But if you play no energy cards, Stellar Wish becomes very, very cool and very powerful. So that's the way I want to explore Vikavolt. The other way I thought about playing it was actually just with Fire Energies and Salazzles, because you draw so much with Salazzle and you don't care that you play Fire Energies because you're just trying to reach, just basically cycle Charger Bug and do similar things to like ZoroControl, where you get your deck so thin that you are just literally using Stretcher for Charger Bugs and then using like a Fire Crystal to then Roast Reveal into those Charger Bugs and attach them, and like Stretcher again. So that's a pretty cool idea that I've been thinking. I think Vikavolt's definitely something I want to play around with. It's so unique. The Charger Bug is such a breakable ability, in my opinion, that there's something here for sure. Persian Box is another one that I feel could end up being a broken deck. It has so much potential with the flexibility of Boost Energy, its own ability in Catwalk, giving you great sort of response times. You can instantly respond on your opponent, because if one of your GXs gets taken out, you can instantly just go ahead and grab the 2 instant answers that you need, be it, you know, fresh draw supporters, be it extra energy cards, be it Pokemon recovery, stuff like that all at once. You can just guarantee that to make sure that you're always responding to your opponent. Obviously, when you're an all colorless style attacker, you can build your list towards a certain direction if you feel like it's going to be good for anti-meta. Maybe we can have things like Malamar for extra energy acceleration. Maybe you can play Dance of the Ancients Koko and Lightning Energies, depending on what different attackers you feel are relevant in the game right now. Dugong's one that I think will be guaranteed in the list because you're playing Boost Energy anyway. Dugong being very, very good against Baby Clown decks, and also very good at dealing with the likes of early Zoruas and early Inkays and stuff, so that's really awesome. I think this sort of thick Pokemon-based deck using the Dedenne GX, maybe even a Giovanni's Exile here or there as well, to clear them off your board and also do extra damage towards your Vengeance, is actually pretty cool. So I think it's also one of these decks that I really want to experiment with. It's flexible because it's all colorless and you can just tech how you like, and having the Catwalk plus Dedenne charge is going to be a pretty nice engine for you, I think. The weaknesses are that Vengeance is slow to really build up. You need to have some good turns of finding lots of Pokemon. You need to be Vespiquen-esque, where you have maybe like 25 Pokemon in your build, which is going to clog up a lot of space. And at the same time, you are really reliant on Boost Energy. So if Catwalk isn't coming off, maybe if some of your non-GXs are being knocked out, there's no guarantee that you'll get back into Boost Energy for the following turn. So Persian Box may end up being a little bit subpar compared to like Persian going inside a ZoroRoc deck or something like that, but something I definitely want to explore just as a throwback to Vespiquen, so I thought it was worth noting. Porygon-Z is a very interesting rogue stage 2 deck as well to bear in mind. The idea is that you're going to play a bunch of different tag team like 1-ofs or 2-ofs in the deck, and essentially for the right matchup you'll put down the one that isn't getting hit for weakness or is trying to hit for weakness on your opponent's Pokemon for big one-hit KOs, whilst also taking hits and then Aceroling it back up and basically spamming it in the different matchup that you need it to. The idea is to have great type coverage against a bunch of different relevant decks right now, and of course the Crazy Code provides insane energy acceleration for all of your special energies. The weaknesses are that, again, you are very reliant on getting Crazy Code rolling, and also there are a number of one-hit KO decks. Even for some of these tag teams, they can be in range of the likes of Reshiram and Baby Blounds, and that's definitely a worry for you. Buzz Pheromosa, as I mentioned, has saw a lot of success in Japan, but at the same time, that was before Reshiram was released, and being weak to fire is very, very bad, because all the fire stuff seems to be the best. The big payoff, really, of Buzz Pheromosa is that you can use the Beast Game GX attack to take additional prize cards. And if you can set it up properly, you can even go for Lieutenant Surge into double green search to get 4 Beast Rings and Beast Game to take an additional 3 prize cards. And that really does feel like cheating. If you're able to do 50 damage and take 4 prize cards on something, it's absolutely stupid. So that could be a really awesome way to close out games that people don't expect. It could be an amazing sort of mini combo in builds. So definitely something to bear in mind. I'm not sleeping on the power of this card at all. But I'm skeptical that the sort of quad build that we saw work in Japan really translate over, because it's all coming out in the same set as the Fire, which was not the case in Japan, so definitely something to bear in mind. So that's really the cynicism I have around this deck. But that Beast Game GX attack is definitely worth building around, and I'm sure some people will find a way to weave this into a deck here or there. Giovanni's is an interesting way to bring back Mill. Obviously, the idea is you spam Giovanni's Banishment whenever you can. It might be Banishment, it might be Exile. It's been translated a couple different ways, but you're trying to get rid of Diglets so that they have their abilities going off. You have Rhydon as well, which can attack for a DCE and mill the top 5 if you have used a Giovanni's that turn. The idea is really being aggressive with your mill. Obviously, Rhydon evolves into Rhyperior, so having this aggressive discard is a very interesting way to go. The issues, of course, is that Giovanni isn't drawing you cards, so you really have to try and draw as many cards as you can without using supporters. So we're looking at things like Pokénavs, we're looking at things like Acrobikes, Judge's Whistles, whatnot, which could be pretty awkward for you. Or on the flip side, you could just go for like Cynthia's on certain turns and then Giovanni's on certain turns. But that means you'll have some big power spike turns of mill, but then a few turns off, which is also a little bit awkward. So it's going to be interesting to see what the sort of average milling potential of this deck is overall, because it seems like there'll be turns where you'll do like 7 cards from your opponent's deck, and then turns where you'll be doing like 1 or none, which also seems very scary. And at the same time, Diglett can get shot off by the likes of Muck, which is already very awkward for you because that's a big part of your milling strategy. You feel a lot slower if Muck is on for the opponents, and there's no real way that we can try and punish that outside of like maybe Guzma it up and try and stall it there, because at the end of the day we will have some milling package type cards, because we might even be Lucimining back Giovanni's, even though we'll probably play like 4 copies of this anyway. Maybe something like a Mewtwo as well could be in the deck to recycle Giovanni to the top of our deck. That's really the direction I see for this sort of archetype, but overall one that I'm a little bit skeptical of, because whenever you have to spend a supporter per turn which isn't drawing you cards, that straight away rings alarm bells that you're not going to be the most consistent deck out there. Crabominable is a very interesting build. Fight Alone is the attack that you are trying to work around here. Essentially have not many Pokemon on your bench at all. Maybe just a spare Crabrawler would be the only thing on your bench actually. And the idea is to use Fight Alone to get big damage for just a DCE, or a boost energy, or a counter energy, whatever you want. Maybe a combination of all 3 of them will be in your deck, so that you can chain these attacks. I think you can benefit greatly from like Poké Gear and a green search-based engine, because you'll just be playing these crabs, and also you're hitting good type coverage as a chunky non-GX. You have the potential to play buff padding if you want to, because you have that 4 retreat cost, so a 190 hit point non-GX sounds pretty memey, and it can do a good amount of damage if the opponent has to put down Pokemon for their own strategy. The only issue is, of course, there'll be decks that don't have to do that, and then your own output is very, very poor. You're just doing 30 plus 50 more. So if your opponent only keeps 1 Pokemon active, you're literally just doing 30, which really does suck. Even with like a choice band, only 60 isn't really good pressure. And if they're playing healing, that's really going to be bad for you. So I think the sort of issues here is that you are reliant on special energies, and at the same time you don't really have much draw power, because you don't really want to have an engine on your board. You just want to have Crabrawlers and Crabominables, that's really it. But the big payoffs are there. You're hitting good typing for ZoroRoc and Pika Rom, which, as we've known, until Unbroken Bonds came out, this is, you know, the best typing to be. And you're a chunky non-GX as well, so there's definitely something behind this archetype. It might be worth the awkward payoff. Greninja&Zoroark is a tag team that I really have not much hope in, but I know there will be some people testing it, because it is a throwback to Turbo Darkrai, and we do have a good number of energy accelerators out there right now. We have Naga, we have Darkrai GX, we even have the Darkrai Prism Star, which can get this rolling quickly. Dark Pulse doing 30 plus 30 for each Dark Energy attached to all your Pokemon. For me, it feels a lot slower than the likes of the Fire stuff, and that's basically where I immediately say that this is not going to see much success. At the same time, you have fighting weakness, so you get caught in the crossfire of people teching for Pika Rom, teching for Zoro, so that immediately just says we're too reliant on a tag team, which is already weak to a very popular type, and you're probably slower than the fire stuff anyway. That's why I'm not the hugest fan of Greninja&Zoroark, but again, the damage output is there and people are believing in it, so I thought it was worth a mention. Psychic Spread is the last one, I think, here. As I mentioned earlier, I'm sort of bunching the Gengar and the Weezing all together, even though I think they will be two separate entities. They will have very similar shells, in my opinion. They'll both be playing the likes of Boost Energy, DCEs, Spell Tags, Treasures, and just thick lines of the evolutions themselves, with the intention of spreading on your opponents. The good thing about both of these archetypes is that the spread is flexible. You're going to be having Spell Tags. Gengar definitely being the most flexible, thanks to its own Shadow Pain ability, but Weezing also having that Detention Gas ability is going to be very strong against some of these quad-based builds, if there are going to be some quad-basic decks out there right now. And yeah, it just seems to be an ability worth building around in many cases. It's a mini version of Flygon, which is a throwback to an archetype that a lot of people did love way back when. The weaknesses are that you don't really have much draw power for a lot of the time. I think you might both be playing Treasures and Mewtwo to just basically put more supporters on top of your deck. But of course, you're both ability reliant, so you can't go for like Green Search or whatever. You are quite evolution based as well, so that's something to bear in mind. And your low outputs for the baseline is always something to be aware of, because there will be some tanking builds out there. There'll be some like quad Gardevoir, which is going to have a lot of Acerolas. There's obviously ZoroRoc, which is going to be Acerola spamming all the time as well. So these are things that obviously spell bad news for the spread decks, and that's something to bear in mind. So going back to the top decks, pre-Unbroken Bonds, let's have a look now that we've discussed the new competitors, how these archetypes are going to be changing based on, you know, the new contenders that come out from the set, as well as cards that they can all introduce into their own decks. So I've split them into declining, thriving, adapting, as well as non-movers as well. These are the four sort of categories I like to break them down in. And this is a quick little slide to show you where I think these decks all fit into. We've got the QuagNag, the lone thriving archetype. I think this is the only big winner from the Unbroken Bonds release. Obviously, a non-GX water-based deck is going to appreciate a red tag team Pokemon coming out that's obviously weak to water. Adapting, I foresee ZoroRoc, Pika Rom, and Blacephalon. For non-movers, I've slapped Ultra, Necrozma, and the Zapdos variants. And for declining, we've got the sort of three control decks in Hoopa, Sylveon, and ZoroControl. We've got Celosaur looking pretty weak with the fire stuff incoming. Passimian and Beast Box are kind of like fighting-based builds, trying to capitalize on the amount of Pika Rom and ZoroArk, and they seem to have inherently worse fire matchups. And we have Vikavolt as well. As I said at the start of the video, it was already sort of like just hanging on in the format, and it might be falling off at this point. Let's have a look at the additions that QuagNag gets. Couple cards really. The Fighting Quagsire that we get, that does 120 for 3 water, is probably the biggest addition. At the moment, it plays Onix, that is nice and recyclable via Stretcher already. But the Quagsire only requires 3 energy, so it's a lot easier to get into play. It's a lot easier to sort of power up quickly. And it also means if someone is going to maybe Field Blower away a Wishful Baton, you are only losing 3 energy instead of 4 from the Onix. And it also gives you license to play a thicker Quagsire line. I'm foreseeing 4 Wooper, 3 Water Quagsire, and 1 Fighting Quagsire. That's how I'm sort of picturing the archetype. And also Pokegear comes into the list as well, potentially. We've seen a couple of questionable supporters in some recent builds of QuagNag, the likes of Sightseer and Judge, and now we have the option for Pokegear to help out consistency if we really want to. We gain a couple of great favourables. That's pretty much the idea here. Reshiram seems to be one to pick up. I've also put Persian Box because of the new Quagsire. That seems like it wouldn't be a difficult matchup, especially because all your basics have 70 hit points. The Woopers and the Poipoles both have 70, so you're not worried about early Dugong pressure or anything like that. And you're going to be hitting for weakness on the Persians and Dedenne and stuff. That sounds really good for you. I've notably not put down Baby Blounds as a favourable. I think just because they're a non-GX deck, typing means nothing, and they'll be quicker than you most of the time. So I think that will only ever be an even matchup. I think it still can be winnable, but you may be surprised. We may have to like tech for that matchup, or it may come down to how many Blacephalon they actually put into play, and if it plays towards a late Magikarp Warlord after you've done a Volk spread, But if they only ever put down one spare Blacephalon and one active, it feels like that'll actually be a race that you lose a lot of the time, surprisingly enough. Combo Honchkrow seems to be an awkward threat for you. I think you're likely to play a Rangaroo, but I think that's an archetype that you really don't want to face. You can lose just off of Let Loose alone with this archetype. It really is reliant on hitting not only your stage 1s, but multiple of them, and at the same time you want batons and you want aqua patches. You want all sorts of things at once, so Honchkrow definitely seems like it could run riot over you. Moving forward, I think, water type is definitely one that's relevant, and I think having a nice little improvement on Onix, in my opinion at least, is worth noting as well. So slightly better against the fighting weak stuff, and you're naturally good against Reshiram, and that's going to claim a few wins just straight out the gate because it's an archetype that a lot of people will look to be playing, in my opinion. Even if there's going to be more things like Blacephalon GX or Flareon GX, that sort of follows the same principle. Even if Reshiram ends up flopping for different fire supports, as long as it's GX based, you're going to be fine against them. ZoroRoc is one of these adapting archetypes. I think Zoro's always been adapting, and its partners have always been changing. And as we know, it's a very flexible deck, so naturally it has a lot of potential additions to the build to consider. Boost Energy is one of them, as well as the Persian GX and the Dugong. I foresee Dugong definitely going in ZoroRoc, and it might even be taking over the ZoroRoc parts of the deck. Because Lycanroc seems to be less relevant. I can actually foresee the Lycanroc part of the deck sort of get replaced by Marshadow and Machamp because it'll take up less spaces for you, and that sort of caves the way for the Dugong, and it means that playing a couple or 3 boost energy seems to be reasonable for me. Honchkrow GX could be nice for type coverage and also offering you that unfair GX option. There's obviously the little Psychic Marshadow to help protect you against some Buzzwole players, and Mewtwo can be like the mini VS Seeker as well, just as an option. So lots of different reasons why ZoroRoc could be changing. For new favourables, I just put Greninja&Zoroark. I actually think there aren't that many like straight up favourables for you. I think the fact that we're making these changes are because we want to keep up. ZoroRoc is known for trying to be like this 50-50 deck that just makes consistency its win condition and having more optimal turns than the opposing decks out there right now. I think Dugong will really help out against the Baby Blown builds. I think if you want to tech for Reshiram, there's also the Slowking, which a lot of Japanese players have thrown in. It works off a triple boost energy, and it just does Psychic, which is 60 plus 20 for each energy attached to your opponent's active. So it can naturally knock out Reshiram if they load them up. So that's another thing to bear in mind. Couple threats coming out from the set. Unmanned Power Plant obviously can shut off trade, which is a worry for you. Might mean that we need to add in more stadiums or stadium removal into the list. Similar to how ZoroRoc first kicked off, remember way back when Tord started off with Zoropod, he actually played 4 Field Blower when it was a Gardevoir heavy format, and now we have this awkward stadium card that you always want to have removal for whenever you see it. Something to bear in mind, and Crabominable will be a new horrible matchup for you to deal with because it's a tanky fighting type non-GX, and you normally need to fill your board if you want to do much with your deck, so that feels like an auto loss for you. Moving forward, like I say, you just want to change up the deck to whatever's popular. Obviously, we've seen ZoroRoc go through many renditions. We've seen Thick Muck, we've seen ZoroRoc Cario, just extra fighting support for the Pika Rom decks. We've seen Zoropod, we've seen all these different Zoro builds, Zoro Banette even. It feels like we're coming into this new age where Zoro is going to be letting in the likes of Persian and Dugong into the build, maybe even this Marshadow Machamp being the fighting element just to keep mirror matches in mind and to keep Pika Rom on the mind as well. This seems to be a nice sort of one-off include alongside like just a couple fighting energy and counter gain that can get you over the line. That's how I'm foreseeing my recent ZoroRoc builds, where Rock is actually either being removed completely or thinned down as well, something to bear in mind. Obviously, when you have Ditto, like, we could even be playing like a 1-1 Lycanroc line these days in favor of like a 2-2 Dugong. Similar to how we've seen Weavile be like a thin line alongside Lycanroc. That might be the place where Lycanroc ends up. Pika Rom has a couple great new additions. The Dene GX being able to dig deeper into your build. Electromagnetic Radar getting you the Pika Rom itself as well as Zero Auras or the Dene, like I said, to dig. Pokegear is also a nice option. And I think these three in combination really does tend toward a turbo-based build. I think trying to keep up with the Reshizards and the Gardevoir&Sylveons out there sort of makes me think that a Pika Rom that's going to play a bunch of cards, Dedenne, and let loose once you've got as many energies into play as possible seems to be the best route. New favourables, I think Honchkrow is definitely one you want to see. Obviously, you're lightning based, you really don't need much against them, and you have so many outs of an unfair GX that you should be raring to go. You could do a lot of your work turn 1 before they use an unfair GX against you, especially if you go first. New threats, the Fairy Charm is lightning based out there right now, and you're going to be very GX focused, so Field Blower might be an addition, which is always awkward because you're trying to be a fast deck, and having to hold a Field Blower for the right time always feels awkward. Crabominable, again, this feels like an archetype that you really don't want to run into. It's, only, like, Crabominable is only really good against these two decks, I would say, so it's not necessarily a really high-tier threat, but it's just something I thought was worth noting, because obviously it's going to be bad if you do run into it. Blacephalon is really interesting, actually. It seems to gain a huge amount, and yet I don't think it's going to be all that good. I think it's moving towards the Baby Clown deck. You gain Welder, Green Search, Fire Crystal, Salazzle, Baby Blacephalon, Unmanned Power Plant as an option, Pokegear, and Beastbringer. What more do you want as a Blacephalon player? And yet still, like I said, because Baby Clowns is coming out, what's the point in playing Big Clowns? You'll just lose to Baby Clowns. So I can foresee Blacephalon becoming exactly a one-of in the Baby Clown deck. That's pretty much how I see it going. You do gain some favourables, Porygon-Z, like tag team-based decks, as well as that Greninja&Zoroark, basically because you can reach huge numbers. That's kind of the only upside of playing the Blacephalon GX-based build. It's that you naturally hit higher than Baby Clown a lot of the time, so you can build towards these big tag team knockouts at faster rates with Nagas charging up and whatnot, if you do still go down that route, especially with Welder, so bear that in mind. But I think Baby Clowns just seems to outclass this deck, and I think I didn't really ever want to put this as a declining archetype, because if people want to play the GX build, like, they gain so much that they are basically a thriving deck, but at the same time it just feels really strange to play this build when you could just be playing the non-GX variant, and that's pretty much how I see this archetype going into. Onto non-movers, Zapdos Jolteon really doesn't gain much. Electromagnetic Radar is an option, just so you can have searchability for likes of Zeraora and Koko GX in one turn, maybe exactly a one-of option in your deck if you really want to. You also gain Pokegear as an option to give you even more potential to Guzma on turn 1, which is a pretty cool thing to bear in mind. For new favourables, you like seeing Honchkrow. I think this is really the hero of the format if Honchkrow does become big, because we can just keep threatening them with Jolteon. You can just go first and attach 1 lightning energy, and Honchkrow's already sad. Like, even if they use an unfair GX, you can get straight back into that game very, very quickly just with an energy draw, which you have so many outs for. So it's not like you need to get lucky off your top decks. You just have like half your deck as outs, which is pretty insane. For new threats, I think Baby Clowns is actually something you do need to be a little bit concerned about, just because, like I said earlier, 120 hit points is annoying for Zapdos to get through, and it might force GXs onto the board. It may be a case of you using Zapdos to set up knockouts here and there, and then your Jolteon does some spreads all at once to knock out multiple Blacephalon. That might be one way around it, but it does seem awkward for the Zapdos player, seeing as though the Baby Clown is just going to keep swinging in the active turn after turn. Moving forward, I think it looks still to be as aggressive and powerful as before, but it is a little bit worried by the Baby Clown. I foresee this dropping from tippy top tier to maybe top of tier 2, just because Baby Clowns just seems to be so much stronger than it, in my opinion, especially because it's strong against Zapdos. That's kind of what I think about the Ultra Beast build as well. I think you'll never play the Radar in this list. It's pretty much just Pokegear that you could consider. Greninja&Zoroark being pretty favourable because you have your Baby Buzz turn. You also have, those build-up turns with Koko GX if you really need to. Baby Clowns, again, still difficult for this build. You don't have Jolteon to play around with numbers. You have one big Buzzwole turn for a big knockout, which maybe means you can Electropower for you another through a couple other Clowns here and there, but you still will end up having to use Koko GX more than likely, which really does hurt you. So definitely a matchup that I don't feel comfortable going into. I think the Ultra Beast is still strong. Nihilego can hit some great new tag teams. It can copy Magical Miracle for 200 damage. It can copy Double Blaze or even Flare Strike for 1 attachment, and that's very, very powerful. So Nihilego gets stronger just by the amount of tag teams coming out right now. So I think it's good for those, but you still are worried about baby clowns. So I can see these Zapdos decks being still relevant, still strong, but they don't really gain much from this set. So that's the reason why we're calling it a non-mover overall. The final non-mover is Ultra Malamar. It does gain a couple of cool things. The Dene might give you some extra discard synergies, giving you some searchability into this. Obviously, the Dene is not that searchable compared to the likes of a Lele or a Marshadow, so it may not even make the cut into the deck. Mewtwo is another one to sort of consider, seeing as though you can like top deck yourself as supporter for the following turn, which is a nice consistency helper. And Pokegear is another one to bear in mind. I think none of these are like particularly good options. They're just ones that are there. I think honestly, Ultra Malamar may not change a single card in its list from Unbroken Bonds, which is a little bit sad to say. For new favorables, the tag team stuff that you can just one bang through. Porygon-Z is going to rely on tanking, as is Greninja&Zoroark, which you can get through. New threats, really, Dugong is actually the scariest card, I think, for Malamar. You do not want to see two Inkays fall, and Dugong does exactly that, so that's definitely something that's worrying. If you've put a Mew into your deck, that's a space in your deck, but also a space on your board. So even if Dugong isn't able to do the snipes, it's essentially a pseudo-Wudo style effect where you're not able to have as many Malamars as you would want against like some Zoroark players, which is going to be really easy for them to then do some Guzma plays and limit the amount of Malamars you get into play in any game. So Dugong is a real threat, and I think Baby Clowns, once again, is very awkward for you. They're probably going to be faster than you with Welder Engine. They'll probably take the first prize. They're non-GX for that the entire game, and there's not much the Malamar player can do about that. So I think this, again, still has answers to tag teams, and that's pretty much the only thing propelling Malamar and keeping it afloat right now. But it seems to be slower than the non-GX Blacephalon deck. If you haven't noticed right now, I really do think Baby Clowns is top tier. I think it comes into the format huge, and it's going to be awesome just because the way I'm talking about it against all these other matchups, it feels like it outpaces all of them. And I don't see a way that these decks can come back right now. We don't have Reset Stamp just yet, so these decks have no comeback potential against Baby Clowns. That's pretty much the worry right now. Onto the decks that I believe are declining. I think there's actually a huge number of declining decks, to be honest. For ZoroControl, there are some cool toys to sort of kit your deck out with. Lieutenant Surge's strategy being one of the coolest supporters for controlling decks in a long time, really helping you adapt to your opponent's board all in the same turn. Lucario and Melmetal might overtake something like a Articuno in the deck because you end up becoming an additional Acerola kind of target for you, whilst also having that sort of mass removal of energy in one DCE. It means that you can just play 4 DCEs now and not have to worry about rainbow energies. Mewtwo can help reset some supporters for you, as well as Marshadow being a nice check to Buzzwole, which is otherwise a real problem for ZoroControl unless it plays weakness policies. So those are all cool additions to consider. I think the Surge's strategy definitely goes in. Lucario Melmetal seems very reasonable as well. For good new matchups, I think Persian's pretty much the only one because you'll probably out-resource their triple boost energies for the most part with the likes of dumbbells and whatnot and all your hammers and flare grunts and stuff. I think for new threats, it's the fire stuff. The fire stuff really seems horrible for this deck because they have so much burst potential. You can't really deny the amount of damage they have because they have so much recovery via fire crystals and whatnot. You can never really, even if you play things like Skull Grunt for like Baby Clowns and whatnot, they're still just going to have fire crystals and get easy recovery. Charizard has Salazzle as a great comeback like draw engine and hits just ridiculous numbers on its own. So that all seems very scary for me. And Gardevoir&Sylveon also seems like a scary matchup because they have so much energy acceleration. You can't really be aggressive against them anyway because they're already having resistance on you and they have so many Acerolas regardless. And there'll be a point where they use Magical Miracle and that's also going to be very awkward for you. So I think all of those are threatening matchups. I think Control is really going to suffer from this, and that's pretty much what I'm going to say for the next two archetypes as well. Regigigas Hoopa can benefit from the same stuff. The Lucario Melmetal potentially being like a 2 or 3 of in this deck, to be honest, maybe even becoming one of the new faces of the deck. When you're not against fire, it is a star player, but when you are, it's unusable. It also gains Unmanned Power Plant as a potential extra disruption-based stadium to beat out some opponents that are reliant on abilities. Stack Attacker being an extra non-GX option that can jump up to 200 hit points, being technically tankier than a Regigigas, unless it has an Ancient Crystal on. But yeah, the same story applies. You don't want to see the fire stuff. You don't want to see Gardevoir&Sylveon. You even don't want to see the unfair GX deck, because they can just use an unfair GX and power up a secondary attacker to get through a Hoopa, and you just lose. Vikavolt also seems really bad if they're going to be, well, if it's going to be built a way that I think it's going to be built, which is going to be trying to hard cycle the Charger Bug as much as possible. It's going to be hard for you. Like, how do you remove the Charger Bug over and over again? Like, you really can't have many options against that because they can just cycle the Charger Bug. That's going to be their entire archetype, and that's just something you can't really play around at all. So those are all awkward matchups for Hoopa for sure. Definitely something that I was surprised to think about when I was sort of setting this down on paper, but it's actually a lot of bad matchups for Stool. So I think it may naturally just be fading out, even with Lieutenant Surge's strategy, which a lot of people are hyping up through the roof. I think inherently, you still can't beat the fire stuff. That's just my own opinion. I think the fire stuff is going to be way too strong for you, so that's my own opinion. I think all the Stool decks, including the Sylveon, seem to have no real place in the meta right now if fire is going to be as prominent as I personally believe, which is fun. I am very happy to see these decks sort of like rotate themselves out by the amount of like fire energy acceleration we gain from the new sets. The new sort of worry and the new sort of headache in the game is going to be Gardevoir&Sylveon and Honchkrow putting your hand to 0. I think that's going to be the new sort of annoyance when you're at tournaments rather than seeing Lusamine loops. Sylveon does gain a couple good fairy charms, and it does gain Lieutenant Surge's strategy once again, but I still think those bad matchups are still bad matchups for you, so you really don't appreciate the amount of energy acceleration that's coming out from the new set. Celosaur is weak to fire, and before you can say, oh, just add in weakness policy, duh. I mean, there's going to be green search-based builds if you're baby clowns, and there's going to be Salazzle-based builds for Reshiram, so if they want to play one blower, they can, and they wreck you, and even if they don't play blower, Reshiram can hit for 300, and Baby Clown can hit unlimited damage if they just store up their energy cards, which seems really reasonable. So Celosaur seems very ugly. It does gain Pokegear, which can really help out, because as we know, it has a kind of patchy draw engine. Similar, like recently we've seen Bill's Analysis sort of flesh out the deck a little bit, but now having Pokegears to fish out, you know, even more supporters could be good for you, just to have like Erica's at the right time, Guzma's at the right time, Acerola even if you need to in the deck. That seems pretty cool for Celosaur to have a one-off now, when you can have Pokegear to fall back on to also help like early game bricking, which is pretty cool. So I think you're weak to fire, and that's all she wrote for Celosaur. I really think we won't be seeing much of it ever again unless the fire stuff happens to flop, which I really don't foresee happening. Passimian Koko does gain a couple new things. It can explore a green search Pokegear based engine. We've seen it alongside Magcargo, we've seen it alongside Jirachi. I've even played it with Zeb Striker recently. But it has a new sort of toolbox to try out. You can literally just have 4 Koko, 4 Passimian in your deck, and then have the green search Pokegear style build. Green search helping you grab like energy lottos and stretchers and whatnot every single turn, which is pretty cool. You do pick up a couple interesting matchups in Greninja&Zoroark and Persian, which is kind of fine. New threats are obviously Mew can deny Koko spread damage. Apologies for having it down at the bottom here. It's meant to be up top. Yeah, Mew's the thing you're most worried about. Psychic spread is actually awkward. You really don't want to see Weezing, that's for sure, because you'll be doing the flying flips against each other. It's just Weezing has its natural ability, which is going to be awkward for you. Gardevoir&Sylveon naturally has a bunch of healing, and that's hard to deal with. And Baby Clowns is going to be bad for you as well, because, again, they can be a quad build. They can only have 2 clowns down at once, and then it's really hard for Passimian to reach knockouts on them. So, yeah, that seems very bad for you. Overall, I think this deck was kind of built with the intention of beating Malamar, ZoroRoc, and Pika Rom. It still does those things, but it's a lot less relevant now. Obviously, ZoroRoc is going to survive. Pika Rom, I'm assuming, will survive as well. Malamar's going to survive. Like, they're all going to be around. It's just they're not going to be seen, you know, 2 or 3 times throughout a tournament, maybe only once or twice throughout a tournament, and you'll be facing fire stuff, which is a bad matchup. So I foresee Passimian Koko to be a much less safe play these days. Beast Box was essentially brought about to be an anti-meta deck. It was here to try and help against Zapdos and ZoroArk. That was really the intention from the creators of this deck. It does gain a couple interesting new cards. You could try out Beastbringer alongside Buzzwole if you really want to. Pokegear is another option that you can definitely think about, but you really don't like seeing the fire stuff either. You're going to be slower than them. You can't use your stack attackers in that matchup at all, so you're waiting around for B-String when they're already just smacking you and getting ahead in the prize race, and then you'll lose the game. So I think you won't appreciate any of those new matchups, really. And there's the low-key threat of Marshadow coming out as well as a one-off, which could body your Buzzwoles and also be annoying for your Naga GXs as well. So a really horrible tech card can just completely ruin this deck as well. So I think this was only ever an anti-meta deck to begin with, and the meta's shifting away from it, so it just looks inherently weaker than other options we have right now. Vikavolt, again, the sort of last deck that I thought was worth discussing. I think the thing that I want to explore with Vikavolt among anything else is Pheromosa Buzzwole. I think if there's any chance Vikavolt will survive, it's because adding in a Pheromosa Buzzwole for that GX attack can actually swing some games. If you hit something with a Ray for not a knockout, Pheromosa Buzzwole to take that extra prize seems really interesting, and it's something I want to explore. That Beast Game GX is definitely a game changer in my book, and it's something definitely that I'm keeping in mind. If you're not against the fire stuff, that seems to be a nice thing to power up for Vikavolt in general, because it can do good damage, and it makes you a little bit less reliant on hitting your rare candy turn 2. Whereas Ray is passing or using Tempest, Pheromosa Buzzwole is at least doing Jet Punch pressure and setting up knockouts for Rays down the line. So I feel this is a new coat of paint for Vikavolt. That's the real thing I wanted to explore. In terms of new favourables, I don't think there are actually that many. I think there's a lot of big tag team hit point Pokemon, which are very difficult for Ray to reach, especially when one of them is a fairy type in the first place. They're going to probably take the first prize against you because they have good energy acceleration, and that's going to be awkward for you. And I think the fire stuff is also just going to be faster, more consistent, and that spells bad news for Vikavolt. So I want to explore it for Pheromosa Buzzwole, but overall it's probably just going to be a little bit slower than the other new tag teams coming out in the set. So finally, we're going to have a look at a couple revitalized rogues. The three things on the right here, Aerodactyl, Silvally, and Nidoqueen, are all ones I have in mind for building around, because boost energy really does give them a good chance. I'm really looking forward to trying out a Nidoqueen-based build alongside Meganium Swampert and triple boost energy. Obviously, you're going to be bad against the Clown build, but there's more than just the Clown deck. Like, I've said a lot that you're weak to Clowns and that's a bad thing and whatnot, but there will be counter decks to Baby Clowns, don't you worry. So we can find a way for Nidoqueen to maybe make it okay. Silvally, I think, also has a good chance. It is just a stage 1. We have a lot of the type coverage tools now, the memory tools for Silvally, and the problem with him previously has always just been that he's required 2 attachments, and now boost energy helps you get there, and then you have his own energy acceleration from himself. So playing for triple boost energy actually seems fine, because we can complement that with basic energies and DCEs, and because you're using Turbo Drive, you're actually getting those attachments and being less reliant on boost energy throughout the entire game, but just enough that you can get those big bursting response knockouts, which seems really good for me. You can combine it again with the likes of Dugong. I'm very hype on that card, if you haven't noticed, because it's one of the only ways we can defend against Blacephalon in my book, because you can do a 120 to the active, 60 to the bench, and then the next turn, like they reply on the Dugong, then you put down your next Dugong, you Guzma, and then you knock out the thing you already put 60 on and a fresh Buzzwole all at once, and it's just going to be the only real non-GX that can jump over a Blacephalon at times, which is definitely something to bear in mind. Aerodactyl is another one of these Pokemon. It always has the potential of hitting for 180. That's always something to bear in mind. 180 is not like dealing with some of these tag teams, which is a little bit awkward right now, but you're still a non-GX, so a non-GX two-shotting a tag team is still efficient, and we do also have like green search-based engines to help find fossils now as well, which is a low-key, pretty cool thing to bear in mind. So that seems to be revitalized a little bit by boost energy. Another deck that might love boost energy is Doublade. Essentially, you have 4 DC and 4 boost energy as outs now, just to attack with tool drop. We have the new Metal Core Barrier to make this tanky against some other non-GX based builds like Zapdos, which is previously a little bit awkward for you. And you might pick up the good matchup of Gardevoir&Sylveon if that deck really does take off, as I expect it to. Having a nice auto win against that is definitely a cool option, so keep an eye out for Doublade. Tool Drop may end up making its first splash in Standard, which is pretty cool. The last one is just Hitmonchan. I don't foresee this being huge, but there's definitely going to be a rogue build around it with the Hitmonchan into Hitmonlee, into the finished combo Hitmontop that we get from Unbroken Bonds. and then into using like Fairy Transfer to win the game. That's going to be a fun archetype to test out as well. We also get Fighting Dojo, so the hit and run alongside Diancie, you can actually knock out 60 hit point basics, so the Hitmonchan itself gets a little bit better, and we've seen it work in Expanded, so there's some hope for Hitmonchan here, but without Strong Energy, I do think it's going to be a little bit weak, so even with Hitmontop, the big sort of finish attacker, I think it will be still a Rogue variant at the end of the day. For general shifts in the meta, I think Fire really is amazing. I think these archetypes are going to be at the top of the game, as I keep reiterating. And the thing that really makes me happy is that they're all based around having lots of physical energy in your deck and lots of energy acceleration via Welder, lots of energy recovery via Fire Crystal. These three things, all in combination with one another, should really help push these Lusamine, Plumeria, stalling decks out the way. Just get them out of the format. I'm so sick to death of playing them, and I think the Fire decks inherently have such strong matchups against them that it might finally be time that they are no longer viable. I'm very happy to say that that's most likely going to be the case. I thought that was going to be the case for Pika Rom, and they've still stuck around, but now I'm hoping that with the threat of Pika Rom and the Fire stuff, they'll finally just not have enough good matchups to be worth playing anymore. So I'm really hopeful that they will no longer be all that viable. There are a couple new archetypes that have the potential to put you in top deck mode, aka the Gardevoir&Sylveon and the Honchkrow deck. So we might be seeing some more Oranguru. We might be seeing some more, Salazzles and ZoroArks just coming into decks for mini engines. Even if there's not a 4-4 ZoroArk based deck, maybe you just play a couple in your build so that you can protect yourself from the likes of Gardevoir and Honchkrow, so bear those in mind. Green Search and Pokegear becomes a great engine, and it's going to be one that a lot of people experiment with because it can bring about some great quad-based builds, and it can also just be good for decks that aren't playing a lot of abilities inherently. Even if there are some Stage 2 decks out there which have abilities, you can Green Search to find yourself Ultra Ball and Rare Candy, and then you're happy from then on. If your Stage 2 is up, you're already content with that, so that's definitely something that's also worth noting. For me as well, the final note is that fighting becomes less of a amazing type. I think it was great in this format for Team Up because you're trying to hit two birds with one stone in dealing with ZoroArk and Pika Rom. That's still the case, but ZoroArk and Pika Rom, like I said, might be adapting and staying towards the top of the meta for sure. It's not like they're going anywhere. It's just that the Fire decks might, take control a little bit more, and people have to worry about more matchups than just Pika Rom and ZoroArk and Zapdos. I think the format now becomes, instead of a story of 5 decks, it becomes a story of 6 or 7. So that's definitely how I foresee the meta going. So yeah, those are the general shifts. That's going to be it for this video, guys. I hope you did enjoy my discussion. What do you think about the new archetypes? Did I get anything right? Did I overestimate anything? Do I underestimate an archetype that you think is coming out? Did I spark your imagination on any deck? I hope I did. I'm going to be kicking off with some new Unbroken Bonds decks as of tomorrow. So let me know which ones you want to see first, and I'll be getting straight onto them. So hope you did enjoy, guys. It has been Joe from OmniPoke, and I'll see you guys in a video tomorrow. Cheers.